My name is Otto Thorwarth, and I just want to share my story and what God's done in my life. I was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and grew up basically in a field house. My dad was a high school football coach here, and so sports were a very big part of my life growing up. I was very, very competitive. It didn't matter what sport it was, whether it was football, baseball, or volleyball. I'm going to be competitive if you put somebody in front of me. And I had this dream growing up as a kid to be a professional athlete. And at 5 foot tall and 110 pounds, I was very limited as to what sports I could compete in. So when I was in high school, I learned about these little pint-sized athletes that worked up at Oaklawn Park called jockeys, and I decided to kind of pursue that and see if I could make a career out of it. And so I started off walking hots at the track in the morning and worked my way up to a groom and then an exercise rider. And then in 1990, I actually got to see my childhood dream of being a professional athlete come to pass when I rode my first race here at Oaklawn Park in front of all my friends in my hometown. And it was very exciting, and it was a little nerve-wracking, but it turned out well. I ended up winning my very first race here and on a 30-1 shot nonetheless against people like Pat Day and Calvin Burrell and Garrett Gomez. I mean, some of the best in the business that I started out riding with. But I felt like I'd found my place, and so I continued on. I rode for a little over a decade in my first stint as a jockey, won 3 riding titles, just had a lot of success. I mean, it came very easy to me. God blessed me with an amazing career. But after about 10 years of racing, I'd had my share of injuries. I'd had 3 concussions, and along with battling my weight, trying to keep my weight down, I just kind of felt like I kind of hit a wall, so to speak. I had a burnout, and it was during that time that I decided to just not really retire, but just take a break from racing. And so I stepped away, and I was living in Kentucky at the time because that's where I was riding, and I moved back to Arkansas. And while I was in Arkansas, I was just trying to kind of figure out what to do with my life at that time. And it was during that time I was working. I had 2 jobs. I was working managing a car wash for a friend of mine, and then I was also working as an EMT. And my friend and I, who owned the car wash, were sitting at the car wash one day, and we went to a local church here together, and we had a lot in common. We like to hunt and fish and outdoorsy kind of people. And we're sitting at the car wash one day, and we're just talking, and my buddy Spencer, he says to me, he says, do you ever feel like there's more than what we're experiencing in our Christian walk? And I said, yeah, it's funny you should ask. Actually, I've kind of been thinking the same thing. And so he's like, well, why don't we start kind of praying about that and kind of looking into that and see what we can find. And so we kind of agreed to that. That was on a Thursday. And Sunday morning we went to church, and we're in our Bible study class or Sunday school class. And this gentleman walks into our class that, never been there before. You can tell he didn't really fit in. He was dressed a lot different than everybody. He looked like he'd come off a road crew, basically. And at the end of class, the guy leading our class proposed, opened it up. He said, does anybody have anything they'd like to add or say before we close in prayer? And this gentleman who hadn't said anything the whole day kind of slips his hand up. And he says, I just came in here today to ask a question. He said, is there anybody in this class that feels like there's more than what they're experiencing? And, I looked at Spencer and he looked at me, and we were both just like, wow, did that just happen? And so after class we talked to him, and we decided to go to lunch a couple days later. Well, as we had lunch with the guy and kind of got to talking with him, we asked him, we said, what brought you to our class, And he said, well, actually, I was driving down Central Avenue, and I just felt like the Lord led me to go into that church. And so I walked into the church, and there's 20 something Sunday school classes going on, and I'm just walking down the hallway, and I felt led to go into y'all's class, and I'm just like, you just have no idea. I said 3 days ago we both asked each other that exact same question that you proposed in class, and he said, well, then I guess I found the right class then. So he started discipling us, and I was up at my station working on the ambulance one day, and all my habits had changed. I'd gone from watching TV for 24-hour shifts to reading my Bible for 24-hour shifts. And as I was reading one day, I came across Jeremiah 29:11, which is a very popular verse in the Bible. But as I read it, and it started talking about God having a plan for my life, and I realized, I'd never searched to see what that plan was. And so I got down on my knees right there next to my bed, and I just, said, Lord, your word says that you have a purpose and a plan for my life. What is it? And I was completely open to whatever he wanted to do. I thought maybe he would tell me to go to seminary, or maybe to become a missionary to Africa or something. And I was very floored at what he told me to do, because he said, I want you to go back to the racetrack. And that was the last place I wanted to be, and made no sense to me. And so I pulled a Jonah, going to Nineveh. I just, I was like, nah, I'm not going back to the track. I'm going to do my thing. And for 6 months, this word kept coming to me, go back to the track, go back to the track. And it made no sense. And so I was on a flight one day going on a hunting trip with my dad, and I ran into Pat Day, who was a Hall of Fame jockey that I was friends with through my years of riding. And I told Pat, my story and what I felt like God was telling me. And he just looked at me. He says, Otto, he says, you know as well as I do. He says, if God's calling you back to the track, he said, he's got a plan. And when he said that, I'm thinking, of all things for him to say, a plan, because that was Jeremiah 29 that got me to where I was. And so I made the choice to go back to the track, and I went back, and we moved up to southern Indiana, got centrally located between all the Kentucky tracks and the Ohio tracks and Indiana tracks where I was going to be riding. And as we started, I started back to riding, and we found a new church up there, and I switched from being in a Baptist church to a non-denominational, more charismatic church. And the very first day we went to this church, we're sitting in the back row trying to just keep, check it out, so to speak, kick the tires. And right after service started, this lady walks up and prophesies over me, and says that, the Lord spoke to her and said that I'd come from a long distance off, and that I'm following him, and that I'm right where I'm supposed to be. And I was floored. I was like, wow, I've never experienced anything like that. And so that was good confirmation for me. And then about 2 weeks later, the associate pastor prophesies over me and tells me I'm going to ride a champion. And then I was really excited, because I thought, okay, that's why God brought me back to the track. I just left too soon. I got a good horse coming down the pipe. And so I come in the very next week, and Bob, the associate pastor, who knows absolutely nothing about horse racing, comes up to me as we walk in the church, and he's all excited. He says, Otto, he said, I saw this vision last week, and he said, you were sitting on this horse, and he said, you had a bouquet of roses draped across your lap. He said, does that mean anything to you? And I was like, well, yeah, Bob, that's the Kentucky Derby. And he goes, well, there you go. You're going to win the Derby. And I was like, you have no idea what how hard that is to do. I said, you don't just go down the first Saturday in May and sign up to ride the Derby. It's a big process. And so I launched out on this, path to ride a Derby winner, which is a very, hard to come. That's like any kid just saying, I'm going to go win the Super Bowl. It's not everybody gets that shot. And so 2.5 years go by, and I'm riding a lot of winners. I won my 1500th race and a couple more riding titles, but I wasn't riding what I would call champion quality horses. And after a race, I was riding at Turfway Park, and this gentleman hands me a script, and the script's from a Disney movie. And I don't know, I just figured, well, maybe he thinks I'm interested, in horses because I'm a jockey. And I read the script, or looked at it. I didn't read the whole thing, and I found out that they were auditioning jockeys for the part of Ron Turcotte in Secretariat, and I wasn't interested. I was on a mission from God to write a champion. I didn't have time to try my hand at acting, and my wife actually talked me into going to the audition. And so I made the call, talked to the casting director, and found out that the auditions are the very next day. And as I went, I was on my way down there driving to Lexington, Kentucky, and my buddy Spencer calls me from the car wash, and we hadn't talked in about 6 months. And he's like, "Hey man, what are you doing?" I said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I said, "My wife has talked me into going to a Disney audition today." And he just laughed, He's like, "When did you take up acting?" And I said, "No, I haven't." I said, "But Brandy talked me into doing it, And so he pauses for a minute, and he says, "Wait a minute." He says, "Didn't you get a prophecy a couple years ago about riding a champion?" And then the light came on, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, yeah." He's like, "Dude, this is your champion." And I thought, how dumb can you be and still breathe? I mean, this was like right in my lap. But I was too focused on the natural things and wasn't really paying attention to what God was doing in the supernatural realm. And so long story short, I ended up getting the part, got to play Ron Turcotte in Secretariat. It was an amazing experience. And it just goes to show what can happen when we go all in and just kind of push our chips in the center table and tell God, "Here I am, send me. What do you want me to do?" And, his purpose for me was to be in that movie. And so I guess my challenge to everybody that's watching this would be to go to him, pray to him, and ask him what his purpose is for you. And whatever it is, just follow him, and I promise you it'll be a good thing.